Hi there. I want to explore a little bit more this term gnosis, which means knowledge. I suppose it's knowledge of the truth. That's what we're actually talking about, knowledge of the truth. Um, and in order to do this, and I know Stefan Hoyle has talked about this a lot, because it's simple and yet it's complicated. So I want you to consider three statements which we won't categorize for the moment. We'll just take them as three statements. The first statement is Germany lost the Second World War. Okay. The second statement is that Germany won the Second World War. And the third statement is that Germany nearly won the Second World War. And so looking at the second statement first, I think from the evidence of my senses alone, Germany did in fact, we'll take the first statement, because Germany did lose the Second World War. If Germany had won the Second World War, I think we'd be aware of it via our five senses. I mean, there just would be Nazi flags fluttering over my town hall, for example. And you may say the Star-Spangled Banner flies over my town hall, which is as bad as a Nazi flag. But really, really, don't be silly. Now, come on. Get a bit of perspective on this. And also, I don't think I'd be actually speaking to you now if Germany had actually won the Second World War. So pretty much certain that the statement Germany lost the Second World War is irrefutable. So we can really categorize that as a fact of history. Okay. So that's a fact. Germany lost the Second World War, full stop. Put it in your history book, in your history exercise book, boy, because that's the truth. Now, Germany nearly winning the Second World War. Now, that's a little bit more an interesting statement, because you could amass a great deal of evidence to show that, in fact, Germany nearly did win the Second World War. And it was literally, as people say, they shouldn't have invaded Russia. And indeed not. But a Nazi, if he was alive today, would say, it wasn't like Napoleon Bonaparte, who had horses and horse-drawn carriages and guns. We had tanks and armoured personnel vehicles, and we were 50 miles away from Moscow. And if we had taken Moscow, the Soviet Union, being a very centralized state, would have fallen. Russia would have fallen because it would have no central government. And then we could have just literally, there would literally be capitulation pretty much on all fronts. So we nearly did win the Operation Barbarossa, which was to invade Russia. And we nearly got there. And we nearly did win the Battle of Britain. And we nearly did, several other frontiers. They pretty much nearly won. In fact, we pretty much nearly even carried out a big counterstrike, the Battle of the Bulge, which we nearly won against the American armies as well. But of course, by that time, the German army was pretty much on its knees, and it was just simply a sort of dent in the military-industrial complex, or the military-industrial might of the USA. And the USA could have come back with more troops and later on and defeated the Germans again. But the statement that Germany nearly won the Second World War, it does have some merit, and you could back up that. So that's a kind of, not sure that's a fact, but it's certainly an hypothesis. It's a valid hypothesis. That the statement Germany nearly won the Second World War is not false. It's an hypothesis which has validity, because you can really prove that statement is true. Now, that statement is not saying that Germany won the war. It's saying, if you read it carefully, Germany nearly won the Second World War. But nearly isn't enough, obviously, to win a war. It nearly won the Second World War, but it lost. so there we are. And yet, the statement "Germany nearly won the Second World War" is certainly not one to be poo-pooed, and it also has a certain effect, because on the basis of Britain nearly losing the Second World War, a lot of Britain then acquired the nuclear deterrent. And the idea of the nuclear deterrent is that if ever a power threatens Britain again militarily, you can always threaten the invader with nuclear annihilation. So the argument that Britain nearly lost the Second World War was used as an argument for retaining the nuclear deterrent, because the bomb would actually prevent Britain from being invaded, as it might be by the Soviet Union, for example. But it could be any country that was winning a military campaign against Britain and threatening to invade Britain, in fact, as Germany did. So the statement "Germany nearly won the Second World War," is not just sophism. It does have and did influence, in fact, Britain's decision to develop the nuclear bomb. That statement has a political effect. That's what I'm saying. Now, the second statement is that Germany won the Second World War. And there are two ways of looking at this. If you believe that Germany won the Second World War, you are probably insane. You are probably hallucinating. You probably wish that Germany won the Second World War because you're a National Socialist and you believe in the elimination of Jews. So you probably you wish so hard for that to be so that you believe it happened. But a lot of people would say that you are hallucinating because you're in fact insane. So that's one thing. But the other thing is more interesting, because somebody, an intellectual, could write a very, very strong argument to say that in one sense Germany did win the Second World War, because Germany brutalized both East and West Europe to such a degree that in fact nowadays, we are, less sensitive about torturing prisoners, because Germany sort of showed us how to not have a conscience about these things. And you could also say that Germany, the war itself, caused ramifications, for example, in the Middle East, which we're still suffering from today. And if the Second World War had not happened, perhaps the problem of Israel would not have arisen, and Israel would have got its state by more peaceable means, which were agreeable to all parties concerned. So we wouldn't have a problem in the Middle East over Israel and the Palestinians, for example. And so you could actually construct an alternative timeline in which the Second World War never happened, because Hitler was defeated very early on. And politically defeated, that is, and got rid of by the German people at a very early stage, and the Second World War never happened. And in that case, but you could also produce a very complex argument to say that Germany did win the political war. It did win the Second World War because the psychic effect of such a huge war on mankind as a whole was to brutalize us psychically, and led to a lot of the excesses that we see in modernism, for example. And you could point out that the Nazis were very much into modernism and futurism, and being very unemotional about everything, and ruthless, and a lot of the ruthlessness that we see in corporation and globalization, for example, arises from the Nazis' attitude to, to the means justifying the end, sort of thing. So I'm not sure that this argument would be terribly convincing, because other people would say, well, you could say that any point in history, any war at all, ever, has brutalized the human race, and we are still scarred, in fact, by the many wars that have happened before the Second World War and since the Second World War. Hence the statement, war is a bad thing for plants, animals, and children. It brutalizes people. That's one of the effects of war, no matter who wins the war. Okay, so but it's still an argument that somebody could, they sort of go into the stratosphere of intellectual argument and reconstruction of history in order to prove that Germany, in one sense, won the Second World War. So you can hardly say that they're hallucinating. You might accuse them of intellectual sophism or a certain amount of intellectual manipulation. And you'd have to be a pretty clever person to come up with a counter-argument to prove that Germany didn't win the Second World War in any sense of the word. But, for example, certainly Germany was split into East and West as a result of Hitler, and you could argue that division that Germany became a divided society as a result of the Second World War, but whose fault was that, sort of thing? Anyway, the point is that Germany won the Second World War. You could interpret that statement in a certain way, so that it appeared to be true on a certain historical, economic, social, psychic level. Whereas a person who just thinks that Germany won the Second World War, fact, is hallucinating. They're just insane. So you can actually get rid of that view. That becomes falsity, not a fact. Whereas the statement Germany won the Second World War in one sense or another, that's not exactly a false statement of fact. That's interpreting a historical fact. Germany lost the Second World War in a certain way, and saying, well, if you look at it from another point of view, they actually won the Second World War. Didn't lose it. But the fact is, it seems that Germany did lose the Second World War, and that's an irrefutable fact. Okay, and so that Stefan Heuler would say, is that so useful to say that? It's actually more interesting to say that, in one sense, Germany won the Second World War, and prove that with your complicated social psychic argument about the brutalizing effect of Adolf Hitler's policies, and the division of East and West Germany, and the rise of the Soviet Union and the Cold War established by the Second World War, for example. So that's an interesting interpretation of something. So in one sense, they did win the Second World War. So you have falsity, we have fact, we have interpretation of history. And how is all this related to knowledge of the truth? Well, it could be that you could say that we have a fact on one hand, established by the five senses. So I'm not seeing Nazi flags flying over my town hall, so it's pretty definite that Germany lost the Second World War. I can work that out logically. Then you have the madman, the person who believes that Germany won the Second World War because they wanted that to happen, and they see it everywhere because they're looking at the universe through their mad spectacles. With their mad Nazi spectacles, right? And then you have the interesting interpretation of history, which I've outlined. And is that a fact or is that a belief? Well, it's sort of like a belief, I suppose, really. It's not a belief, it's not a mad false belief like the mad person has, that Hitler's alive and well and living on Mars or something. It's not that, and actually Germany has won the war. It's not it's that's kind of a false belief, okay, that an individual might have, or a group of nutty individuals might have. And the interpretation of history is a belief that somebody might have, in some university somewhere, and that's a sort of, it's not exactly a belief. It's an interpretation of history, as one might say, really. Is that a fact, or is that a belief, or what is it really? It's sort of an interpretation. So maybe there's a new category. You have false beliefs. You have interpretations of things that have happened in the past, and you have actual facts, which can be proved logically and with the five senses, or empirically through demonstration of scientific, as a result of scientific methodology. And indeed, history has its own methodology. The study of history has a certain methodology, and it's a methodology which is successful, largely successful, in explaining facts, or certainly adding facts together to explain. For example, did Troy exist? Did the ancient city of Troy exist? And that can be established as a fact, whereas before it was a belief or an interpretation of ancient historical texts, for example. But now it's more or less established as a fact. But I mean, Arthur Evans, looking at Knossos and looking at these baths, looking at these pits in the ground, he thought they were baths, communal baths. That was a sort of belief based on the fact that he was obsessed, like most 19th century people, with baths, for example, and that sort of clouded his judgment of the archaeological evidence. You see, but still, we go back to Gnosis again. Gnosis is not fact. Okay, it's not an establishment of fact through logic or demonstration or empiricism. It's not a belief. It's not an interpretation of scripture or interpretation of facts, or the historical Jesus, for example. And so a lot of people say, well, is it a false belief? Is it just nuttiness? The fact that you can claim that through your gut feeling you have a gnosis of the truth. And this is where, of course, Gnosis Gnostics have to argue the case, really, that they are not insane, that they are of sound mind, and it's not that they just want to believe something, therefore it's true. They really do have a gut feeling, which goes beyond belief and the establishment of fact. But I think that Gnosis does have a defense. It's on the defensive foot, actually, faced with the charge that it's simply trying to believe something because it ought to be true, not because it is true. And they're not even interpreting reality in a certain way. They are creating a different reality, which they think ought to be true, ought to exist, and they're not really that much difference from the nutty person that believes that Adolf Hitler actually did win the Second World War, and that that Adolf Hitler is, and the Nazis are still around, which is hallucination. So to distinguish hallucination from gnosis is the task of the Gnostic, actually, to explain to people that they are not hallucinating, that they are not drunk, that they're not high on cocaine, that they are a sound mind, and that they understand empiricism, and they understand what a fact is, and they understand what a belief is, and they understand what a false belief is, and they understand what an interpretation of history or economics or the human condition is, and that they actually arrive or have a category of thought, a category of thinking which transcends a false personal belief, interpretation of facts and facts themselves. That they altogether, Gnosis occupies a completely different category of thinking, which is nevertheless not hallucination and not delusion. So the Gnostic has to establish this new category of something which transcends belief and fact and interpretation. That your gut feeling really is connected to soul, and that soul has really told you certain things which the rest of your mind or your brain cannot possibly tell you. But of course, then we get into a tautological argument. How do you know that the soul exists? In order to tell you that everything that divine exists, you need one element in order to justify the other element, and you get into a tautology. It's like arguing that the Bible is the word of God, therefore everything in the Bible is true, but it assumes that the word of God is encapsulated by the Bible. So it's a tautological argument which has no logical power, basically, which is why people hold religion in such suspicion, especially post-Enlightenment, because you have to establish the soul exists in order to for some part of you to communicate with soul, and then soul gives you data which apparently is not a fact or a belief, but simply a pointer towards something which is actually true, namely the divine and heaven and God, even if we know what those words actually mean. So you see, when we talk about epistemology, or the study of statements which are true and statements which are false, when you come to mysticism, it's an awfully grey, fuzzy area. And, Gnostics are on the defensive when it comes to arguing from a logical point of view, which is why, of course, a lot of Gnostics say that, Gnosticism goes beyond logic. It can't be established through rational thinking, but rather, and it's not irrational either, it sort of occupies a space between rationality and irrationality, which the rationalists say is impossible for anyone to occupy. That there's only irrationality and rationality, there isn't anything between the two. So the argument continues, and it's not just an argument on paper, an intellectual academic argument, because, for example, as I said about, proving that Germany nearly won the Second World War, and this influenced British decision-making later on as to develop the hydrogen bomb, for example. So these academic issues can have far-reaching effects, so that people, who do believe that there is a space between irrationality and rationality, which is gnosis, that can actually affect their lives. That can actually affect other people's lives as well. That can actually affect decisions made by, I don't know, princes and kings and political pundits and political people make decisions about how people live. So it's important to actually understand that this is not an academic exercise. This is nuts and bolts surviving in this world, because what you believe, and what you know to be true and what you know to be false, has an effect on your life in the lower worlds. And if there are no other worlds but these lower worlds, then this argument becomes of crucial importance, in fact, which is what Professor Grayling, in his book Against All Gods, makes out, that we really do need to debunk religion finally and forever, or we need to give religion a little bit of wriggle room, so that it's possible for some people to carry on being religious, just in the face of enlightenment and rationalism. But he would be on the side of debunking religion forever, because he says it's no good actually giving any value or credence to something which is not true, because you're just then entering into the statement Germany won the Second World War, and you're hallucinating if you say that. You literally are mad. You're literally just wanting to say that Germany ought to have won the Second World War, so they actually have won the Second World War. And because I believe it, it's true. And that, of course, as Rawlings says, not Grayling rather, Professor Grayling says, is in fact would destroy our society if that was allowed to proliferate and allowed to continue. What we believe is true. That statement would literally destroy our civilization, and has nearly destroyed our civilization on many occasions. And it's only rationalism, empiricism, and common sense, and the establishment of facts that has saved our civilization from becoming extinct. So he says that religion is literally a life and death issue, because religion could make our society extinct. It could make human beings extinct as a species. That what we believe is true is a statement which is incredibly dangerous. And that what we need to be is rationalistic and establish everything through empiricism and through logic, rather than just believing something is true because we want it to be so.